They told us we won the war with courage and heroism, but what if that's only half the story? Behind the parades and headlines, darker truths were buried. From Nazi scientists secretly working for the US to entire war crimes erased from history books, these aren't just forgotten facts. They read the stories someone didn't want you to hear. For the first time, we're uncovering 5 forbidden World War II secrets the government desperately tried to hide. What you're about to learn changes everything. In the heart of the Second World War, deep within the Rock of Gibraltar, a group of British naval officers and specialists trained for a mission so secret, even their families believed they had vanished. It was called Operation Tracer, and its purpose was as grim as it was ingenious: to entomb 6 men inside a hidden, self-sustaining chamber within the limestone mountain, from where they would observe enemy naval activity, until their food ran out, or they died. The plan was devised in 1941, when British intelligence feared that Nazi Germany might overrun the Iberian Peninsula. Gibraltar, a key British stronghold controlling the entrance to the Mediterranean, would have been a critical loss. The British Admiralty believed that if Gibraltar fell, they needed a way to keep eyes on Axis naval movements. The answer? A secret bunker inside the rock, manned by volunteers who would be sealed in permanently, unseen and unheard, until they perished. The chamber, roughly 45 feet long and 16 feet wide, was carved into the limestone in total secrecy. It was stocked with enough supplies to last 7 men for up to a year: canned rations, water tanks, a pedal-powered generator, books for mental stimulation, and a periscope system linked to 2 concealed observation slits pointed at the harbor. But the most chilling detail: once the Axis powers took Gibraltar, the entrance to the bunker would be sealed shut, entombing the men inside. Choosing the personnel for this mission was almost as sensitive as the operation itself. They needed men who were not only physically capable but psychologically resilient enough to live in a cave, in silence, knowing they might never escape. Among them were 2 doctors, a wireless operator, and military officers with backgrounds in intelligence and survival training. One such man was Dr. Bruce Cooper, a quiet, disciplined physician from New Zealand. He later described the mission in haunting terms, recalling how they practiced sealing themselves in the chamber, testing ventilation and the pedal-powered communication system. The men were ordered to write letters to their families as though they were dead, and then burn them. They couldn't risk any leaks. If they were discovered before activation, the entire mission would be compromised. The rock's cavernous interior was already honeycombed with tunnels used for defense and storage, so the construction of an additional hidden space wasn't questioned. Even other soldiers stationed on Gibraltar had no idea what was being built behind certain locked doors. A hand-picked group of engineers and laborers worked in rotating shifts under cover of night, sworn to absolute secrecy. If caught talking, they faced court-martial, or worse. The room itself was engineered to be nearly invisible. Its entrance was a narrow shaft disguised as a solid rock wall. Observation ports were hidden behind natural-looking rock outcroppings, and soundproofing was meticulously implemented so no vibration or radio transmission would betray the occupants. For all practical purposes, it was a tomb with a radio antenna. Despite the darkness of the mission, morale among the men remained surprisingly steady. Dr. Cooper later admitted that humor, strict discipline, and regular mock drills helped stave off madness. They created routines, took turns exercising, and even practiced silence drills, spending 24 hours without a word to simulate the isolation that would come. And then, nothing happened. Germany never invaded Gibraltar. Hitler's attention shifted eastward toward the Soviet Union, and the Axis never mounted a serious attack on the rock. Operation Tracer, poised to be one of the most extreme examples of wartime sacrifice, was quietly shelved. The men were stood down. The chamber was sealed, not with its crew inside, but abandoned, its secret buried in limestone and silence. For decades, the operation remained classified. The men never spoke of it, and the government offered no acknowledgement that it had ever existed. Even as declassified documents began trickling out in the 1980s and 90s, the full truth of Operation Tracer remained elusive. Then, in 1997, a team of amateur explorers and historians stumbled upon a strange, sealed chamber deep inside the rock. It matched the rumors. Ventilation pipes, observation ports, storage crates still marked with wartime codes. With it came renewed interest, and eventually, the British Ministry of Defence confirmed what had long been denied. Yes, there had been a plan to entomb British soldiers inside the Rock of Gibraltar. Yes, they were expected to die in silence. And yes, they had volunteered willingly. What drove these men to agree to such a mission? Patriotism? Duty? A sense of adventure? Dr. Cooper, who broke his silence before his death, believed it was about more than war. It was about loyalty, to an idea, to a people, to a time when the threat of totalitarianism made men consider the unthinkable. "We were prepared to die so that the war could be won," he said in one interview. No more, no less. Today, the original Operation Tracer Chamber has been preserved as a historical site. Visitors can walk through the narrow tunnels and peer into the tiny rooms where 6 men prepared to live, and possibly die, for Queen and country. The silence that fills the air is not just the hush of stone, but the echo of secrets long buried. In the winter of 1944, Americans began to notice strange objects floating in the sky. White, shimmering balloons with long tails and dangling boxes. They were spotted from Alaska to Michigan, even as far south as Texas. Most were dismissed as weather experiments or military devices. But the truth, which would only come to light decades later, was far more sinister. These were lethal weapons, launched by the Japanese military, designed to bring terror and death to American soil. They were called Fugo balloon bombs, and they represented one of the most ambitious and bizarre wartime strategies ever attempted. After suffering defeats across the Pacific, the Japanese government sought ways to retaliate directly against the United States homeland. Without long-range bombers or viable sea routes, they turned to the sky, and to the jet stream. High above the Pacific Ocean, fast-moving air currents flowed from Japan directly to North America. Japanese scientists discovered that hydrogen-filled balloons could ride these currents and cross the ocean in just 3 to 4 days. With this knowledge, they began producing thousands of paper balloons, each carrying a payload of explosives and incendiaries. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched over 9,000 of these unmanned flying bombs into the jet stream. They were crafted from lightweight paper made of mulberry bark, sealed with a potato-based glue. Each balloon was equipped with an elaborate altitude control system powered by barometers and timed sandbag releases. Once the sandbags were dropped in sequence, the balloon would remain airborne long enough to reach the western U.S., at which point it would drop its deadly cargo. The Japanese government hoped the Fugo campaign would start massive wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, destroy infrastructure, and terrorize the American population. In reality, about 300 balloons were found or reported in North America, though many more likely landed in remote, uninhabited areas. Some caused minor damage, fires, power outages, craters, but most failed to ignite large-scale destruction. Yet one incident would prove fatal, and it would be intentionally erased from public knowledge. On May 5, 1945, a Sunday school teacher named Elsie Mitchell took 5 children on a picnic near Bly, Oregon. As they walked through the woods, one of the children noticed a strange object tangled in the brush. It was a balloon, deflated, silent, seemingly harmless. As Elsie approached it, the bomb detonated. All 6 of them were killed instantly. They became the only civilians on the U.S. mainland to die from enemy action during World War II. The U.S. government, aware of the balloon bombs as early as late 1944, had already instituted a strict media blackout on all incidents involving the Fugo. They feared that publicizing the attacks would create panic and, more importantly, provide Japan with confirmation that the bombs were reaching American soil. Even after the deaths in Oregon, the military instructed local authorities and the press to remain silent. The incident was quietly buried, and the Mitchell family was told not to speak of it. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese radio monitors waited eagerly for news of success. But there was none. The silence from the American press led the Japanese to believe the campaign had failed, and they eventually halted the launches. Ironically, the U.S. media blackout may have saved thousands of lives by convincing Japan to abandon the program. Behind the scenes, the U.S. military scrambled to retrieve balloon remains and study them. Some were found in forests, on farms, even hanging from power lines. Others were recovered as far east as Detroit and as far north as Saskatchewan. Military engineers analyzed the materials, thin paper, hand-stitched seams, Japanese writing, to understand their origin and function. Bomb disposal units were trained specifically to handle Fugo devices, though few civilians knew of the danger. Some scientists, however, feared the worst. There were growing concerns that Japan might modify the balloons to carry biological weapons, anthrax, plague, or chemical agents. Though no such payloads were ever confirmed, the possibility haunted military intelligence officials throughout the final months of the war. In secret, special units were deployed to monitor remote areas, especially forests, for signs of disease outbreaks that might be traced to a balloon attack. The Mitchell tragedy remained classified for nearly 3 months. Finally, after the war in Europe ended, the U.S. government lifted the censorship order. A short statement was released acknowledging that a Japanese balloon bomb had killed 6 people in Oregon. But by then, the war was nearly over, and the story was largely overlooked by the press. For the families involved, there was no justice, only silence and the quiet burden of knowing that their loved ones had been erased from the wartime narrative. In the decades that followed, remnants of Fugo balloons continued to be discovered. Hikers found rusted bomb casings, deflated paper skins, and unexploded devices in the wilds of Canada and the western U.S. One was even discovered in British Columbia in 2014, 70 years after it had landed. Each find reignited curiosity about one of the war's strangest and most secret chapters. Today, a small stone monument stands near the site of the Bly explosion, honoring Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children who died with her. It is quiet, unassuming, and rarely visited. Most Americans still don't know their names. The government never apologized for the media cover-up or the initial denial of the Fugo threat. In the official histories of World War II, the balloon bomb campaign is often reduced to a footnote, an oddity, a failed experiment. But the silence it created, the intentional erasure of facts, the suppression of grief, the manipulation of truth, speaks volumes. In war, what is left unspoken can be just as powerful as what is told. And in this case, silence became a weapon, wielded not by the enemy, but by those sworn to protect. In the quiet countryside of Harbin, northeastern China, a sprawling complex once stood surrounded by barbed wire, tall smokestacks, and guarded checkpoints. Officially, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Guangdong Army. In reality, it was Unit 731, one of the most horrific biological warfare programs in modern history. During World War II, this Japanese facility conducted human experimentation on a scale so brutal it rivaled the worst Nazi atrocities. Yet after the war, most of its architects were never prosecuted. Instead, many vanished into comfortable post-war lives, with the full knowledge and cooperation of the U.S. government. Unit 731 was founded in 1936 by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a military physician and researcher obsessed with the potential of biological weapons. He persuaded Japan's top military brass that the key to winning future wars lay not just in bombs and bullets, but in disease, engineered, weaponized, and unleashed on enemy populations. He was given near unlimited resources, and under the guise of water sanitation, he built a fortress dedicated to death. Inside, thousands of Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and political dissidents were brought in as logs, a dehumanizing term used by staff. Men, women, and even children were subjected to experiments without anesthesia or consent. They were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, syphilis, and other diseases. Their organs were removed while they were still alive, their bodies dissected to observe the spread of infection in real time. Victims were tied to stakes in open fields and exposed to grenade blasts or flamethrowers to test the effects on human tissue. Others were subjected to extreme temperature experiments, left outside in sub-zero conditions until their limbs froze solid, then thawed, crushed, or amputated to study frostbite. Pregnant women were raped by infected soldiers to examine mother-to-child disease transmission. Infants were born in cells, only to become test subjects themselves. By 1942, Unit 731 had grown into a network of subunits and satellite camps throughout occupied Manchuria. Its experiments killed at least 3,000 people. Some estimates say over 10,000. Entire villages were exposed to pathogens by aerial spray or poisoned wells, resulting in epidemic outbreaks and mass deaths. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were calculated research trials, conducted by scientists in lab coats who meticulously recorded every result. When Japan's surrender became imminent in 1945, Unit 731 personnel began destroying evidence. Buildings were dynamited, bodies incinerated, and prisoners executed. What they couldn't destroy, they tried to hide. Shiro Ishii ordered all records either burned or buried. But the United States already knew. As the Allied forces occupied Japan, American intelligence officers discovered whispers of Unit 731's crimes. The Soviet Union, too, captured documents and some staff during its invasion of Manchuria. But while the Soviets conducted their own war crimes trials, the U.S. made a different choice. It saw value in what Ishii had created. In secret meetings between 1946 and 1948, Ishii and his senior officers negotiated with U.S. officials. In exchange for their research data, including findings on biological weapons, disease progression, and resistance, the United States offered them immunity from prosecution. It was a grotesque bargain, freedom in exchange for the results of mass murder. The logic was simple: if the Soviets had the data, America needed it too. Documents declassified decades later confirmed that Ishii and dozens of his colleagues were granted protection and even absorbed into Japanese post-war institutions. Some worked in universities. Others joined pharmaceutical companies. One became president of the Japan Medical Association. Not a single Unit 731 official was ever tried in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. In fact, when Soviet prosecutors tried to raise the issue during the Nuremberg-style trials, their American counterparts actively dismissed the claims as communist propaganda. The truth was deliberately obscured, not only from the public, but from the very historical record meant to ensure accountability after the war. The silence persisted for years. Victims' families in China were told nothing. Japanese citizens remained largely unaware. Schools never taught it. Museums omitted it. Survivors who tried to speak were ignored or threatened. Only in the 1980s and 1990s did testimonies begin to emerge. Former guards, lab technicians, and even scientists came forward, some motivated by guilt, others by age or circumstance. One man, a former medical assistant, recalled how prisoners begged him to kill them quickly, to spare them the agony of the experiments. He didn't. "We were told they weren't human," he later said. "They were enemies. They were data points." Another described how the smell of burning flesh filled the air during the final days, as bodies were incinerated en masse to erase evidence. In 1995, Japanese activists and Chinese survivors filed lawsuits against the Japanese government, demanding acknowledgement and compensation. The courts refused. The official line remained: there was no conclusive evidence. Only in 2002 did Japan's Ministry of Education finally allow textbooks to mention Unit 731, briefly and vaguely. Even today, the topic is controversial in Japan, with nationalist politicians denying or minimizing the atrocities. Meanwhile, the United States has never issued a formal apology or statement about its role in shielding war criminals in exchange for scientific data. Shiro Ishii died peacefully in 1959, never once standing trial. His legacy, hidden in government files and obscure medical journals, was used by American military and intelligence agencies during the Korean and Cold Wars. The true horror of Unit 731 is not just in its brutality, but in its erasure. Unlike the Nazi doctors of Auschwitz or Dachau, these men faced no judgment. Their crimes were converted into assets, their victims turned into footnotes. Justice was not denied, it was bartered away in the name of national interest. Today, the original Unit 731 site in Harbin has been converted into a museum. Rusting cages, glass jars of preserved organs, and weathered photographs tell a grim story. But many of the names responsible are still missing from the walls. The survivors are elderly now, and growing fewer each year. Their memories, once suppressed, now hang in the air like the lingering scent of rot. History, we are told, is written by the victors. But sometimes, the victors choose not to write at all. In the shadows of Normandy hedgerows and behind the smoke of advancing Allied divisions, there existed an army that never officially existed. It fired no bullets, launched no invasions, and lost no men in combat. Yet it may have saved thousands of lives. This was the Ghost Army, an elite group of artists, sound engineers, and illusionists whose mission during World War II was to deceive the enemy with theatrical precision, and whose incredible exploits were buried in classified files for over 40 years. Officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the unit was activated in January 1944 with a singular mission: use illusion to mislead, confuse, and intimidate the German military. Numbering just over 1,100 men, this phantom force traveled across Europe, often operating within mere miles of enemy lines, constructing entire fake divisions using rubber tanks, sound trucks, and radio trickery. Their most critical tool was imagination. The Ghost Army was comprised of artists from New York and Philadelphia, ad men from Madison Avenue, engineers, architects, and fashion designers. Some would go on to become famous, like fashion icon Bill Blass or painter Ellsworth Kelly. During the war, however, they traded their canvases and sketchpads for camouflage netting and inflatable artillery. One of their primary deceptions was visual misdirection. The team used life-sized rubber replicas of Sherman tanks, jeeps, anti-aircraft guns, and even entire airfields. These decoys were indistinguishable from real equipment from a distance or in low light. Ghost Army engineers would set up these props in fields and along roads, arranging them strategically to mimic the formation of a full division. They even tracked fake tank treads into the mud and erected dummy camps with laundry lines, fake mess halls, and flickering campfires at night. But visuals were only one layer. The unit also deployed sonic deception, using massive speakers mounted on trucks to project pre-recorded sounds of troop movements, tank columns, and construction activity. These audio illusions were mixed by engineers from Hollywood and played loudly, sometimes over 15 miles away, giving the impression of entire divisions assembling or marching nearby. The Germans, listening in, would reposition forces to counter threats that didn't exist. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their work was radio deception, carried out by highly trained Morse code operators who mimicked the communication styles of real Allied units. They carefully replicated message cadence, slang, and mistakes, creating an authentic digital fingerprint. German intelligence, reliant on intercepted radio traffic, often believed these phantom units to be genuine. The Ghost Army's operations were shrouded in layers of secrecy. Members were forbidden to keep personal diaries or take photographs of their missions. They were issued cover stories, some posed as military police, others as logistics personnel. Even frontline Allied troops weren't told who they really were. If they were captured, their very existence could unravel entire campaigns. Over the course of the war, the 23rd conducted more than 20 deception missions across Europe, including some of the most pivotal battles of the Western Front. One of their most audacious feats came in March 1945, during Operation Viersen. Just before the U.S. Ninth Army crossed the Rhine River, the Ghost Army staged a full-scale fake crossing site 10 miles away. Using inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and fake radio chatter, they drew German fire and attention, allowing real troops to cross the Rhine with far fewer casualties. Another operation, outside the French town of Chérens-le-Roussel, involved impersonating the 6th Armored Division for a full week. Artists painted fake insignia on their trucks, engineers constructed dummy tanks behind hedgerows, and soldiers wandered through villages posing as officers, spreading false rumors to local civilians, knowing those words would reach German ears. These tactics weren't just clever, they worked. German commanders frequently overestimated Allied strength by thousands of men, repositioning troops away from key battlefields or delaying reinforcements. One captured German general even confessed after the war that his units had fought divisions that never existed. Yet despite their success, the Ghost Army disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. After the war ended, their missions remained classified, and the 23rd was officially dissolved. Veterans were sworn to secrecy, told not to speak of what they had done, not even to their families. For decades, Their role in the Allied victory was completely unrecognized. Why the secrecy? The U.S. military wanted to retain deception tactics for future wars. Revealing how the Ghost Army operated would compromise future operations. As the Cold War dawned, psychological warfare and misdirection became even more critical. The Ghost Army became a forgotten prototype for the strategies that followed. Many veterans returned to civilian life carrying stories they were never allowed to tell. Bill Blass, for example, became a renowned fashion designer, his military past only revealed much later. Others died before the truth ever came to light. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, when declassified documents began to surface, that the scale and brilliance of the Ghost Army became widely known. In 2013, a documentary titled The Ghost Army reignited interest in the unit's legacy. Survivors shared their stories, of laying out inflatable tanks under sniper fire, of forging division insignias with paint and stencils, of fooling the enemy with nothing but imagination. Their stories, once classified, were suddenly celebrated. In 2022, the U.S. Congress finally passed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act, recognizing the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and its sister unit, the 3132nd Signal Service Company, for their unique service. But for most of these men, the recognition came too late. The Ghost Army was not a fighting force, it was a performance troop on a battlefield, turning war into theater and illusion into survival. Their mission saved lives not through destruction, but through misdirection. In a war defined by firepower, they wielded rubber tanks, sound waves, and silence, and won. In the chaotic aftermath of Nazi Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied forces swept across Europe seizing territory, weapons, and documentation. But behind the scenes, another race had already begun, not for land or power, but for minds. The United States, desperate to gain an edge in the emerging Cold War against the Soviet Union, launched a top-secret intelligence program that would bring over 1,600 former Nazi scientists to American soil. It was called Operation Paperclip, and its details were so sensitive, the government covered up their origins for decades. These weren't just low-level technicians. Many were high-ranking officials in Hitler's war machine, scientists, engineers, and doctors who had built the V-2 rocket, experimented on prisoners, and developed weapons of mass destruction for the Third Reich. By any measure of justice, they should have faced the Nuremberg trials. Instead, they were secretly given new identities, whitewashed records, and top government jobs in America. One of the most famous of these men was Wernher von Braun, the brilliant German aerospace engineer who developed the V-2 rocket that rained down on London during the war, killing thousands. Von Braun had joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and held the rank of SS Sturmbannführer. He worked directly under Heinrich Himmler and oversaw the Mittelwerk factory, where thousands of prisoners, many from concentration camps, were worked to death under horrific conditions. Despite this, von Braun was seen as a national treasure by U.S. military officials. After his surrender to American forces in Bavaria, he and his team were quietly whisked away to a secret military base in Texas, then later to Alabama. There, von Braun became the father of the U.S. space program, ultimately designing the Saturn V rocket that took Neil Armstrong to the moon. The moral cost of this achievement, however, was buried in classified documents. The architects of Operation Paperclip knew that bringing Nazi scientists to America would cause outrage if it became public. The program's name came from the paperclips used to attach sanitized biographies to personnel files, removing references to war crimes, SS affiliations, or Nazi party membership. Background checks were altered, incriminating evidence destroyed, and State Department objections overruled by military and intelligence authorities. President Truman had originally banned the recruitment of Nazi party members and anyone involved in militarism. But the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA, along with the Army's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, simply ignored this. They argued that if America didn't take these scientists, the Soviets would, and that national security justified any compromise. Some of the men brought over included Arthur Rudolph, von Braun's deputy at Mittelwerk, later awarded NASA's Distinguished Service Medal. He was quietly forced to leave the U.S. in the 1980s when his Nazi past was finally investigated. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, whose experiments on prisoners at Dachau involved extreme pressure chambers, freezing tests, and forced oxygen deprivation. He was honored in the U.S. Air Force until his legacy came under scrutiny in the 1990s. Walter Schreiber, a military physician who had been involved in Nazi medical experiments, including vaccine trials on unwilling human subjects. He was relocated to Texas, where he worked under U.S. supervision before fleeing the country when his past was exposed. The secrecy surrounding Paperclip was extreme. Families of Holocaust victims never knew that former Nazis were living and working comfortably in American towns. NASA employees worked under former SS officers without realizing it. Even many members of Congress were kept in the dark. Publicly, these scientists were framed as former Germans, not former Nazis. The cover-up went so deep that when the press tried to investigate, military officials stonewalled or denied. In the 1950s and 60s, a Cold War narrative dominated American media. These men were now loyal Americans, working to defeat communism. Their pasts, when acknowledged at all, were written off as youthful mistakes or political necessity. But the truth began to surface in the 1980s, when a combination of investigative journalism, declassified documents, and survivor testimony forced a reckoning. Journalists like Linda Hunt and historians like Eric Lichtblau began piecing together the files, revealing the full scope of the program. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was an institutional effort to launder Nazi war criminals into respected American citizens. The U.S. government resisted transparency. FOIA requests were denied or delayed. Names were redacted. In some cases, agencies claimed files had been destroyed. But eventually, the facts became impossible to ignore. Operation Paperclip had knowingly protected and rewarded men who had committed crimes against humanity, all in the name of national interest. By the time the truth reached public consciousness, most of the scientists were dead or in retirement. No one was prosecuted. No apologies were issued. Von Braun, who died in 1977, remains a celebrated figure in American space history, with museums, schools, and streets bearing his name. His Nazi ties are often footnotes, if mentioned at all. The story of Operation Paperclip forces uncomfortable questions. How far should a nation go in the pursuit of power? Can great achievements justify unspeakable moral compromise? And who decides which truths are too dangerous to reveal? Today, the legacy of Paperclip lingers, not just in the rockets that flew to the moon or the satellites that orbit Earth, but in the precedent it set. That expediency can outweigh justice, that history can be edited, and that the line between enemy and ally is sometimes drawn in pencil, not ink. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?